Look at this. What language do you think this is? Russian, right? It's got to be Russian. It's in Cyrillic, it's in Central Asia, and that's what you'd guess. Well, it's not Russian. Sound it out syllable by syllable. And if you happen to speak Mandarin, something is going to click halfway through. Let's take a look. 回族,我是中国人. Say it slowly, and that is Chinese, written entirely in the Russian alphabet. This is Dungan, the only variety of the Chinese language on earth that is officially natively written with an alphabet instead of characters. It's spoken by around 150,000 people, and almost none of whom have ever set foot in China, and almost none of whom can read a single Hanzi. And yet, linguists who studied it will tell you it's one of the closest things we have to a recording of what Mandarin actually sounded like 150 years ago. So how does the Chinese language end up alphabetized in Cyrillic in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan? Quick context, because the language only makes sense once you know who's speaking it. The Dungan are descendants of the Hui, Chinese Muslims, ethnically and linguistically Chinese, religiously Muslim, concentrated for centuries in China's northwest, Gansu, Shanxi, and Ningxia. In the 80s, 60s, and 70s, a massive brutal uprising against Qing rule, the Dungan revolt ended in defeat, facing an army that had just spent over a decade fighting them. Thousands of Hui rebels and their families fled west, crossing the Tian Shan mountains in one of the worst winters on record, and settled just across the border in what was then the Russian Empire, today's Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. I'm not going to dwell on that crossing here. It's a brutal, incredible story, and it deserves its own video. What matters for this video is what happened next. They cut off contact with China almost completely. For well over a century, no trade, no travel, eventually no shared vocabulary for anything invented after 1880s. And that isolation is exactly what turned their language into something unique. Here's the core problem. The Dungan had linguistically speaking. They spoke a dialect of Mandarin, specifically older forms of the Gansu and Shanxi dialect. But when they arrived in Russian territory, none of the infrastructure for writing Chinese came with them. No printing presses with Chinese type, no schools teaching Hanzi, and no scribes trained in classical Chinese characters. Characters take years of dedicated schooling to learn, even if you're immersed in them. These were farming communities rebuilding from nothing in a completely different country. So for decades, the language mostly just lived in speech. Grandparents to parents to kids, no standard writing system at all. And then in the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet Union rolled through Central Asia with one of the most ambitious literacy campaigns in modern history, creating written scripts from scratch for dozens of unwritten languages across the USSR. And Soviet linguists sat down with the Dungan community and did something that had never really been done before. They built a writing system for a Chinese language using an alphabet. First, it was a Latin-based. Then in the late 1930s, Soviet policy shifted across every minority language into Cyrillic, and Dungan went with it and stayed there. That decision is still in effect today. Newspapers, textbooks, poetry, radio scripts, all in Cyrillic, which makes Dungan right now in 2026 the only Sinitic language in the world whose official everyday native writing system is in Chinese characters, not pinyin used as a teaching tool like you'd see in a first-year Mandarin class, not a romanization used by linguists in the footnotes, an actual complete functioning alphabet used by actual communities for actual newspapers instead of characters. If you've ever studied Mandarin and had to grind through stroke order, tone marks, character recognition, just sit with that for a second. An entire Chinese-speaking community skipped characters completely and forever. And it worked. People are still fluent, still literate, still writing poetry in a script that has 0 characters in it. Okay, so it's Mandarin in an alphabet, but here's where it gets genuinely interesting for anyone who actually speaks Mandarin, because Dungan isn't a perfect mirror. It drifted tones first. Standard Mandarin has 4 tones. Dungan has 3. Somewhere along the way, 2 of the original tone categories collapsed into 1. Mandarin's first and second tones tend to merge into a single tone in Dungan, while Mandarin's third and fourth fourth tone map onto Dungan's remaining two. If you've spent months drilling the difference between ma, 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 imagine a version of Chinese that just simplified that system down by a quarter. Then there's vocabulary, because Dungan speakers spent a century and a half surrounded by Russian, Kyrgyz, Kazakh, and going further back, Persian and Arabic through Islamic religious life. The language absorbed loan words from all those. So you'll get a sentence that is grammatically and structurally Mandarin using Mandarin sentence order, Mandarin-derived core vocabulary with a Russian loanword sitting right in the middle of it for something like tractor or committee, because those words simply didn't exist in 1870s Gansu dialect and had to come from somewhere. And then there is the time capsule effect, which honestly might be the most interesting part, because Dungan split off from the mainland so early and developed with almost zero contact back to China. It preserved words, expressions, and pronunciations from the 1870s that have since shifted or fallen out of use entirely in modern Mandarin. Linguists who study history, historical Chinese, phonology, trying to reconstruct what Mandarin sounded like before the 20th century, treat Dungan almost like a linguist fossil. It's a living dialect that got frozen at the exact moment its speakers walked out of China and never fully thawed. So put it all together, and here is what you get. A Chinese dialect written in an alphabet nobody in China uses, with a simplified tone system, sprinkled with Russian and Persian and Turkic loanwords that still, after 150 years of near total separation, sounds unmistakably like Chinese the moment you hear it out loud. There are reports of Chinese linguists visiting Dungan villages for the first time and describing the sensation as almost eerie, understanding maybe 70 or 80% of a conversation immediately, purely by ear, despite the fact that the person speaking to them cannot read a single word of Chinese and has never been to China in their entire life. For most of the 20th century, Dungan had something most minority languages didn't get: active state support. Under the Soviet Union, there were Dungan language schools, a state-funded newspaper called Xie Ti Qi, October Banner, Dungan radio broadcasts Dungan literature and poetry being actively published and studied. Then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and that entire support structure disappeared almost overnight. No more centralized funding for minority language, schooling, no more guaranteed radio slots, and economically, the practical, useful language for getting ahead in newly independent Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan was Russian. Still, the original lingua franca, not Dungan. So over the last 3 decades, you've seen a slow but steady shift. Younger Dungan, especially those moving to big cities like Bishkek for work, are growing up speaking Russian first, sometimes Kyrgyz or Kazakh second, and Dungan third. If at all, there are accounts of Dungan elders in mixed villages joking half seriously that their Kyrgyz and Kazakh neighbors now speak better Dungan than their own grandchildren do. It's a strange twist in the story. A language that survived a genocide, a mountain crossing that killed most of the people attempting it, and 150 years of total isolation from the linguistic homeland. And the thing that's actually threatening to erode it now isn't prosecution. It's just modern life, cities, economy, the political pull of a bigger regional language. In recent years, there's been some pushback. A handful of state schools in Dungan villages reintroducing language classes, renewed academic interest from linguists both in Central Asia and in China itself, where Dungan is increasingly studied as a window into historical Mandarin. But it's still, by most measure, an endangered language. UNESCO level endangered. Not extinct, not close to it, but shrinking. So here's what I find genuinely remarkable about all of this. Language usually needs a homeland to survive. A government, a school, a system, a critical mass of native speakers enforcing it every day. The Dungan had almost none of that for most of their history. They rebuilt a writing system from zero, in someone else's alphabet, in someone else's country, and kept a 19th century form of Mandarin alive for 5 generations, with essentially no help from China at all. And now, ironically, the language is more vulnerable to disappearing in an era of open borders and internet access access than it ever was during a century of total isolation. If you want to actually hear it, search for Dungan language video clips or 回族报 or newspaper archives online. There's more available than you'd expect for a language with under 150,000 speakers. If this kind of thing is your thing, languages that split off, frozen in time, and turned into linguistic time capsules, subscribe because there are a lot of these stories out there and I want to keep digging into them. I will see you next time. Bye.